So now we need to work on the game over state. So the situation where a game over is going to occur is when there are blocks up to the very top row of the grid like this, and then the player doesn't move their blocks off of the stack of blocks before they move down. So like if there's blocks here, this isn't game over yet because the player still has a chance to move away like this and move the blocks before they drop down. But if they do drop down on top of a stack that's full like that, or even if it's half full, like say, so either of these two stacks, if the player put their blocks here or their blocks here, and then the quad landed there, then there are blocks landed above the top row. And as soon as that happens, that's what triggers a game over. So like that, as soon as that happened, then the game would have ended because the player let blocks get above the top of the grid and they weren't controlling them anymore. So that's a subtle distinction. Like these blocks are above the top of the grid, but they're part of the player quad, so that doesn't matter. But as soon as there's a scan here that finds blocks that have been placed that are no longer part of the player quad, then that's a game over. So we can add that to our scan, because we do row scans already. Make array of all blocks in grid, so we're doing row scans already. We can do an additional row scan. It might as well be here within the logic, right? We can just do another row scan that goes one further. Instead of adding a block to an array here, we'll just trigger the game over state. So what we need to do is break up this logic so we can reuse it in a separate function. I suppose I'll just add one more thing to this function that just is a check for game over function. And all this is going to do is something very similar to what's happening here. I don't really want to just copy and paste this. I want to be able to reuse this logic. Make another top level variable called all blocks in current row, and this will be an array of block BPs. And this is just to have, before we return, we set this to what we need it to be. So I'll give this a description so that it makes sense. Holds the references to all of the blocks in the row which was most recently scanned. So what this will allow us to do is take this functionality and break it up so that I can reuse it. I'm going to just copy this for now into a new function called scan one row for blocks. And this will take in which row we're going to scan as an integer, row index, and hopefully you can see what I'm doing, but I'm going to take the functionality here and just break it up into a sub function. Then I can reuse it in check for game over and in this function. So here we're taking the index and passing it to this node here, but instead we're going to pass it into scan one row for blocks. And what scan row for blocks is going to do is set this array, all blocks in current row, to some new values. So the first thing it's going to do before it does anything else is clear this array. so that it only contains the blocks in the current row. And then at the end, every block that it found, first I'm going to scoot this over so that I can feed the input in properly. So that goes there, just as before. And now it's going to populate all blocks in current row. With the block that it scanned that wasn't part of the player quad. So it's the same, it's accomplishing the same thing as before. We're just breaking up the functionality into a little helper function so that we can use it in two different places. So if this is true, then we add the current block to this array. And when this loop is complete, we just return. And now, inside of this function, where we originally had this logic, we'll instead call this function, and after we return from that function, we add all the elements from this array that we just populated for one column into this array. So now we need to do a for each loop on this array and simply add this element to this other array. It should preserve the same order that all the elements are being added, row by row, into all blocks in order. So the main reason I'm doing this is so we can use this functionality to check for game overs. But we're doing something different with our data, so now we have to do it, two different wrappers. We're wrapping this in two different ways. This is the one way we're wrapping it to preserve the original functionality we had. And as a bonus, it sort of simplifies this function a little bit. And before I forget, we need to go to this new function and add the object types array as a local variable. One array element, world dynamic. Get a new one here, put it in. I need to do this again because the parameter name is not correct for some reason. And now I can remove object types from this function. It's not being used. And now inside of check for game over, well, first I should ensure that this logic is working as it did before. It should be exactly the same, so there should be hopefully no errors now. Seems like everything is working as before, which is good. No errors, so now we just need to reuse that logic in this function and scan one row above the top of the grid. So not -1 here. So what I mean is in check for game over, we're going to pass in num rows as our row index instead of num rows -1, and that will put us one row above the top of the actual grid. So we get num rows and pass that into scan one row for blocks. And now what we need to do is check the value of this array if this is longer than 0, that means there's a placed block in the row above the top of the grid. And if that's true, that means we are in a game over state. So if this is greater than 0, then that means we are now in a game over state, because there's a placed block above the top of the grid. So if this is true, I'm just going to print string and just say game over, and we need to stop spawning new player quads and do a bunch of other things to make sure the game logic pauses properly when a game over is reached. So to start with, I'm going to try making a new global variable just called bGameIsOver, and that's a boolean, initially false, and we set it to true here, and everything that cares about whether the game is over or not needs to check to make sure the game is not over before it does anything. So I want to find the least number of places where I need to insert this boolean check. So let's go to so here in the player controller, when the player gets a game over, we need to stop this timer and disallow further player movement. So I think it'll be something quite simple here. So I'll just do a custom event and say end the game dash player controller. And this will just clear timer by function name. Automatically fall one space. So I'm just going to copy and paste here. And then again, it's a bit of a messy solution, but I'm just going to set is quad falling faster to true so that all the other player input actions are stopped. And just see what that does. Things are still going to break if I don't fix other things, so I just want to see what I need to fix before I worry about trying to fix it. So when we check for game over, if this situation is true, we're just going to have this boolean for now and see if we need it. But for now, I'm just going to call a function called end the game, and this will do a sequence of things just like before, but one of them will be to, on the player controller, call end the game player controller. And we'll see what else we need to do to get the game to stop, to stop. But one other thing that stands out to me right now is we need to make the timer bar stop moving, right? Or in fact, maybe just have it destroy itself entirely. So what I'll do first is turn off its collisions and slow it down so that this will slow to a crawl and then it will disappear, so that it gives it a bit more of a game over animation. If it just immediately disappears, it's like, oh, whoa, that's really jarring. But I think if we have a event here called end the game timer bar, and we'll do a timeline here to slow down the speed of the movement. So we'll do timeline and reduce horizontal velocity is what I'll call it just for now. and it'll go from 1 to 0 over the course of 2 seconds, I suppose. So at time 0 it'll be 1, and this is going to be a multiplier to change the horizontal velocity. And at time 2 it'll be 0. And I'm just going to call this velocity coefficient. And I will make probably, let's see. I don't want to have to do a new multiplication every frame here. So instead I'll just do it here. Only while this is active will we update this value. So we'll set horizontal velocity to this value times the coefficient. But we need to be careful about modifying the value that we use as the input, because then there'll be a feedback loop where this will get smaller faster because it's going to take in a smaller value every frame. So we need a maximum, I suppose, horizontal velocity. And that will be the same value as we currently have it set to. And this is the current one, so the only reason I'm doing this is so that so this will be a linear decrease, because it's always going to be starting with the same value. So we'll set the horizontal velocity to this number times the coefficient, and that should be a float. And when this finishes, we will just destroy ourselves, I suppose. After a short time where we're stationary, then we'll destroy ourselves here. So we'll just see what that looks like. I'm sure there's going to be some things that sort of break, but I just want to see what happens when we get a game over now. So it didn't trigger anything. So something is going wrong with our logic. So in the game mode, when I call check for game over, one thing that could be going wrong is I'm not actually calling this function. The place to call that would be right after make array of all blocks in grid. Instead of returning here, I'm going to first call check for game over. I'm going to go ahead and add a description to this function and say scan the row immediately above the top of the grid if this row contains any placed blocks, then enter the game over state. Several things are going wrong. One of them is we need to check for game over every time the player places a block down, not when they clear highlighted blocks. So that was the wrong place to put it before, so we don't want it here. We instead want to put it whenever the player places down a block and is about to spawn in a new quad, somewhere in this logic here, right here. I'm not calling the actual functions here when I run the GameOver function here, end the game. So I need to call end the game player controller, and then I need to call end the game timer bar. I should make sure the game is not over before I do all this stuff, so we want to branch here and say if the game is not over, then keep going, otherwise just stop, I suppose. So in order to ensure that we actually stop, let's see, where do we return to? What's calling this function? I think it's being called by the player controller, actually, here in finish falling. So we do call check for matches here after this returns whether or not the game is over. So we just need to see if that is going to be a problem or not. I don't think it will be, but we'll see. So now when the game ends, hopefully no quad will spawn, the preview blocks won't change, and the timer bar will slow down, everything will just sort of end. But nope, we see the player is still able to move, a new quad still spawned in. Actually no, a quad didn't spawn in, but we're still controlling this one. So something isn't being properly handled. And I think what's not happening is we're not actually calling end the game. We're checking for game over. We're setting these variables, but we're not calling end the game. So that's a crucial aspect. And in fact, we can set game over inside end the game. So just set this variable to true inside of here. And now we should hopefully see some things happen. Whether or not it's going to be correct, we'll see. Okay, so it's one thing too late. And that makes sense because we're still controlling the player quad when we place it. And when we do the check, it's still considered player quad, so we just need to do the check in a different order. So when we're in this function, we check for game over, but we haven't transitioned the quads yet, so spawn new quad is when we remove the references from the current player quad. But I think we can explicitly do that before we check for game over, and it shouldn't affect anything else. So when we check for game over, we should be able to just set all these references to null because we're about to spawn a new quad anyway, and then those references will be updated to the proper values. So I don't think this will break anything if I just set these all to null, but it may break something, in which case I will remove this logic, but I think this could fix it. So all I'm doing is setting all four of these to nothing, so that the check will consider the blocks that were just placed as offending blocks. But it may break normal play before we get to the game over check, so let's see if it still works properly. Yeah, because it may consider this a game over when it's not, but we'll see. Okay. Seems to be okay. So one last thing we need to do is disable, well, one of the things I think we need to do to prevent issues is disable the timer bar from doing anything. Like if there might be a race condition here where the timer bar clears blocks like that after the game is over, which we don't want to have happen, so we can just turn off collisions on the timer bar in this function here as soon as it starts. I'm just going to set collision enabled or set overlap events to false. So on the timer bar mesh here, I'm just going to turn generate overlap events to false. So that it just won't overlap anything anymore as soon as this event is triggered. That way we shouldn't run into any weird race conditions where logic that shouldn't happen during game over does happen because the timer bar was in a certain location. So the one side effect of this is if we do get into a game over state, right when the timer bar is on the far right hand side of the screen, it's going to go past the end, but that's fine. That could logically be considered intentional. If the thing goes off the right hand side when the player gets a game over, it's like, you know, things have literally run off the rails. And the game is just, you know, the player has failed, so the system is broken down, so it no longer obeys the rules that you would expect it to. So I just want to test that out. If I get a game over here, see it goes past the edge, but I feel like that's not really a problem. In fact, it's kind of cool that it's like, oh no, it broke, and now I have a game over. So now we need to add the text, you know, game over on the screen and show the final score and say play again, and then have an option to restart the game. And that should pretty much be a feature complete game at that point. Another thing that might be cool to have is to make all the preview blocks kind of fizzle out when we get a game over. So I'll add another event here for when we are at end the game, we will find all actors of class, get all actors of class, preview quad, BP, and so all we need to do is do a for each loop for each preview quad, call begin dissolve on it, and that logic is already in place, so that should coincide with the breakdown of the timer bar. When we get a game over, the preview quads will all go away. And yep, okay, that's cool. I could make it slightly delayed too, so that it sort of coincides with the disappearance of the timer bar. So all we need to do here is maybe we can do set timer by function name on the current element. We're going to run begin dissolve with a delay of, 1.5 seconds or something, so they'll start to dissolve once the timer bar is already slowed down, is about to disappear. That'll just, give a bit of delay to the impact of getting a game over. It won't be an immediate disappearance, so you have time to process that you lost before they all disappear. Except I didn't do it properly. Let's see. On the object. Oh yeah, so we don't actually want to call begin dissolve because we're doing it here with the delay. So now when I do a game over, they should disappear like this. Yeah, I think that's a little bit more cohesive. So now we need to just print out the words game over on the screen and then play again. And then you just press enter to reset the game. We'll see how that works. That may not be trivial to reset the game to a proper state, but we could just cheat and literally reset the level, but there's probably a neater way to do that, so it's a little bit more quick to jump back in, smoother. But let's see. First we need to add the game over text to the screen. I'm going to sort of copy the title text and title instruction text and paste it onto the canvas. And I'll just call this GameOver text. I'll make it red. And Game Over. Put it at the center of the screen again. And then copy this instruction text, paste that on the canvas, and call this Game Over instruction text. Where did I put the instruction text here? I put it 300 down, so I'll do the same here. And it'll instead say, press Enter to play again. And we need these to fade in instead of fade out. So we'll have a Game Over screen fade in. And this will do the same thing that this does, but in reverse. It'll do the title blur as well. So we'll add a track for Game Over instruction text and title blur. So add a track for the title blur, render opacity, start at 0 and go to 1 over the course of 1 second. And then add another one for the two Game Over objects. And then we need to just have a function that plays that animation. So we'll just make a function called end the game HUD, and that'll just call our fade in animation. I'll do this at half speed, I suppose, again. And when we get a game over, we want to call this function with a delay, just like we do here, so that it doesn't happen until these things have sort of played out a little bit. So I will get my UI element, set timer by function name on this, and call our end the game function. I need to make sure I get the title correct, so I'm just going to copy and paste it. And see if that even works with the underscores and dashes. And I'll go ahead and do like 1.8 or something. We'll see how that looks. Oh, it needs to be initially have a render opacity of 0. Otherwise, it's going to be there to begin with, which we don't want. So in the HUD, make sure we set our default opacities for these objects to be 0. I'm going to click off of the animation so that we don't have those values overlapping. And now let's see how that looks. Okay, I guess it doesn't look too bad. Now to do the resetting, we can manually reset everything and make a function to reset the game to where it was. I want to see what it looks like if I just literally reset the map when we press enter in the game over state. So here we're going to do the player controller settings. If we are in the game over state, when the player presses the enter button, I'll get the game mode here and say get B is game, or no, is game over. Game is over, rather. And if that is true, when they press this button, so if the game is over, then I'm going to try just resetting the whole map. And if the game is not over, then that means we are going to do this once here and start the game. So here we're going to say open level here. This is just a test to see if this is anything close to acceptable. It's not called map level, I think it's called main level. And I'm just going to see what happens if we reset the game in this fashion. It could be terrible, in which case we'll do something else instead. Seems to be okay. I think a way to make it even more seamless would be to make the game over screen fade away and make the title screen fade in, and then reload the level, and that'll trick the viewer into thinking that things smoothly reset. So what I mean is, we'll have a function that, or I guess we'll do an event here so that we can do the delay properly. So I'll make this event called fade out game over, then fade in title screen. So we don't need to make new animations. We can just play the existing animations in reverse. Though actually we probably should make a new animation because we want the blur to remain constant. And if we play the animations the way we have them, the blur is going to change. So well, let's make a new animation called game over fade out, then title fade in. So we want the blur to stay constant the whole time. So we start this at 1 and go to 0. Same with the game over text. And then after a short amount of time, the title comes in. Before I add the blur here, I want to see what happens if we don't include it at all. So now we set the render opacity from 0 to 1 on the title instruction text and the title text. So now we'll just call this animation. We'll try playing it at normal speed. And we're going to want to make sure when we do this once on the player controller so that the player can't press enter repeatedly and have the animation sort of bug out. So we'll do a do once here. And this will get reset when the map reloads because all these values will go back to their default values. So instead of doing this, we're going to play our animation and do this after a delay. So we'll add a delay here. 2.5 should be fine. And this is 2.5 so that the animation will play out and then finish, and then we'll reset the level. So now we're going to get, we don't have a reference to the UI is the problem, but we can get it through our game mode. So game mode, and then get UI HUD, and then call GameOver fade out, then fade in title screen. And we don't have an actual pause functionality during gameplay yet, but we can decide if we want that and implement that in a bit after this. So let's just see what happens now. If we get a game over, then we press enter, this should fade out and that fades in, and then everything seems to reset behind it, and you can play again. So, I mean, it's a bit of a workaround. Instead of having to actually reset all our variables manually, we're just resetting the entire level and hiding it behind the blur and the title transition. It seems to reset, it seems like everything actually resets, but all that really happens is we reload the level. But it seems to look pretty smooth. What's kind of weird is it looks like the blur sort of offsets the geometry behind it when the blur happens like that. It seems like the grid geometry moves around on screen. But maybe that's just my imagination. I'm going to try playing this in a new window. See if it works as well or better or worse. Yeah, it looks like when the radial blur gets to 0, I guess it's just the way the blur works, the Gaussian blur. It makes the geometry sort of seem to shift around on screen. So maybe if I make that blur actually fade out slower, it might be less jarring. So in the animations for the UI here, I'm going to change the time that the title blur takes so that it actually fades out a little slower. So maybe at 2 seconds it'll be 0. And then I'll remove this keyframe here. That way the blur will just fade out more gradually, and maybe that'll help. And then here I'll do the same thing. So set it to 1 at 2 seconds and remove this 1. And then maybe I will move these over so they don't start until the blur has already begun. And then I need to make this happen a little bit quicker so that it doesn't take so long to appear. When the game over starts here, instead of this delay, I'll do 0.8 instead, so that it takes about the same amount of time total to finish. Let's see what that looks like now, if it's a little bit less jarring. It's almost too slow now. The blur fade out is almost too slow. Yeah, it seems strangely like segmented, the way the blur fades out. It seems to like happen in waves. It's a little strange. But maybe it's good enough. If it went along with some music, it might be less strange. One thing I wasn't paying attention to was, does the blur intensity change when we're transitioning from the game over to the title screen here at the end? So here the blur comes in. And then if I press enter here, I'm going to look at the blur in the background. And it seems to be fine. It seems to stay the same. So